You know the heroes who stormed the beaches of Normandy. But what about the confused, starving soldiers waiting in the bunkers? This is their story. Don't miss out on history's hidden side. Subscribe and turn on all notifications. You know the story. The beaches, the boats, the overwhelming chaos, the iconic Normandy landings. But let's be honest, you've almost certainly heard the story from the guys jumping off the boats, not the ones hunkered down behind the concrete. And that's perfectly understandable. As military historian Robert M. Citino puts it, D-Day has become one of the Allies' great historical epics. Whereas for the opposite side, well, the romance just isn't there. It's the uninspiring spectacle of a once proud military force no longer up to the challenge. Ouch. As one can expect, this leaves any military history enthusiast a little short on intel about the Axis perspective in this battle. Now, to be absolutely clear, our intent is not to sympathize with the Nazi regime, its supporters, or its ideology. We are simply interested in uncovering the human element, the confusion, the fear, and the sheer what is happening moments of the less talked about side in this near-mythological clash. First, we'll need to provide context before discussing the landings. This confrontation on the Atlantic shoreline was a long time coming. As early as autumn of 1943, Hitler had gathered his chiefs of staff and told them that all signs pointed to an offensive against the Western Front, no later than spring 1944. But spring passed, and the Allies had yet to strike. This made the atmosphere for the Germans almost unbearably tense, basically sitting around wondering when the world's biggest, angriest doorbell was finally going to ring. It didn't help that Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Rommel, the two men charged with protecting the Atlantic coast, were bickering like an old married couple about where to park the tanks. Rommel, fresh from his educational tour in North Africa, knew that because the Luftwaffe was busy on the Eastern Front, keeping panzer divisions stationed inland, as von Rundstedt ordered, was folly. The North African campaign taught him that without air superiority, moving tanks across the countryside was a near impossible task. The German soldiers, meanwhile, did the only thing they could do to mask their apprehension. They made jokes. One went something like, "If you see a black plane, it's British. If you see a white plane, it's American. When you see nothing at all, it's the Luftwaffe." The others among them, who were Polish, Georgian, and Soviet prisoners impressed into Nazi service, called the Osttruppen, probably weren't in the mood for making jokes, having been dragged hundreds of miles from home. They, along with wounded German soldiers, made up a significant portion of the troops on the coast. By the time the invasion broke out, some of these troops had not been fed for several days. One soldier, Paul Goetz, who was only 17 at the time, recalls the following. "I hadn't had any food or water for 3 days, so around 6 a.m., I walked to a village and begged for milk. The French there knew me, but this time they said, 'Go away.' The Allies already landed with tanks. It seems that at this juncture, the locals' friendliness to their occupiers had officially expired. To make matters worse, they lacked not only food but directive. Convinced the Allies wouldn't dare cross the Channel in bad weather, Rommel had gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday. "Happy birthday, honey." Von Rundstedt, meanwhile, opted not to disturb Rommel, mistakenly believing the paratrooper landings on June 5th were just a ploy to distract from the real target, Calais. By the time Rommel arrived on the evening of June 6th, it was too late. All 5 landing sites were secured. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception strategy, had done its work. Now that we understand the lead-up, let's take a look at the landings through the German perspective. The location we'll evaluate is Utah Beach. In the months preceding the landing, the soldiers there had been busy erecting gun emplacements and setting up stakes, tripods, barbed wire, and landmines. Streams had been dammed to flood the land behind the beach as another deterrent. Such obstacles wouldn't have been present if Erwin Rommel hadn't learned from Axis mistakes at Salerno, Italy in 1943. How many times must the German soldier have laid awake at night, questioning themselves? Will it all be enough? It was on a night like this, around midnight, that over 2,000 Allied bombers began wreaking havoc on the coast. The effectiveness of the bombing raid is disputable, but unlike past raids, there was further escalation. Paratroopers started landing in the vicinity. Skirmishes between the paratroopers and the defenders continued until the sun came up. But by that point it became clear the paratroopers had not come alone. A wall of ships was slowly coming into view on the horizon. A forest of steel. And then, the naval bombardment commenced. Paul Goetz, the same soldier we referred to earlier, said this of the scene. As soon as we walked over the dunes and saw thousands of ships and all those landing boats and barrage balloons, I knew the war was lost. Who could blame him for his hope vanishing? All around him, buildings crumbled and domesticated animals ran freely. But whether they clung to hope or not, the defenders were still prepared to put up a fight. Despite the chaos and with minimal air support, they knew it was up to them. At least a few soldiers must have been glad to finally face action, liberated of that feeling of not knowing when the inevitable would come. Isif B., a staff sergeant, wrote this: "Finally, the hour has come. Although it had to happen, it impressed me a lot. Of course, it is not a trifle. For sure, these hours, the greatest battle is taking place that the world has ever seen. Hopefully, fortune is with us now." Many of the soldiers, away from their positions, tried to regroup amid the maelstrom. Those that did make it converged in fortified bunkers, equipped with machine guns and anti-aircraft flak guns. However, they could only fire upon the invaders in vain as waves and waves of troops landed. When U.S. soldiers inevitably closed in on the bunkers, incendiary weapons like flamethrowers and white phosphorus were used with great effect. These weapons are particularly nasty. White phosphorus continues to burn until it disappears. If service members are hit by it, it could burn right down to the bone. By the end of the morning on June 6th, most of the resistance points had fallen. Much like at Utah Beach, German forces at Sword Beach had to contend with paratroopers who had dropped behind their lines. Helmet Rumor, a German soldier captured after hiding for 36 hours, wrote, "We were exhausted, and we decided to hand ourselves over to the British." At Gold Beach, the defenders were severely weakened by aerial bombardment and were defeated within an hour. At Juno Beach, the Canadian troops managed to not only secure their objective, but they also marched further inland than any other landing party. Finally, at Omaha, German resistance was the most effective because of how close the bunkers were to the shore. But with so many troops landing, the German defenders at Omaha were also, eventually, overrun. The Nazi regime knew what was coming, as did the soldiers stationed on each of these beaches. The problem was that they didn't know where exactly or when exactly the Allies would strike. Furthermore, the extent of the Allies' numerical and material advantages was not known. When Hitler awoke a few short hours after the invasion had begun, he was pleased to hear the news. The air of uncertainty had been cleared, and now, he thought, the Allies would be driven back into the sea.